Good evening, everyone. Bruchim haboim. Welcome. I hope that you are safe, enjoying this Thursday night. At least here in Chicago, we have beautiful weather today, and we are honored and privileged to welcome a very special guest tonight back to Chicago. Our guest tonight is Rabbi Dr. Edward Reichman, who is coming to us live from Westchester County, New York, and it's such a great joy and an honor and a privilege for us collectively as a kollel, as a Chicago community, to welcome Rabbi Dr. Reichman. It's a personal privilege as a mentor and a Rebbe of mine, a teacher of mine for so many years. And the truth is that this three-part series that we have right now that we're privileged to enjoy, last week with Rabbi Dr. Glatt and next week with Rabbi Dr. Shabtai, it actually it was inspired by Rabbi Dr. Reichman's brief segment that we had a couple of weeks ago during Coffee Conversations. So every Sunday morning, we're having these incredible, remarkable personalities who are joining me in my living room and our Chicago community. So a couple of weeks ago, after, thank God, he recovered from his own challenge of the coronavirus, Rabbi Dr. Reichman was able to join us, and he was joining us live from the emergency room with his whole geschäft, with the getup. For those who saw, if not, you can catch it on YouTube. And someone was texting me afterwards. Multiple people reached out and they said how incredible it was and remarkable and inspiring. And that was really what was the source of the idea to create this series, to hear from those medical professionals in our community who are also really Talmidei Chachamim of the highest rank, and to be able to synthesize that perspective for us. So with that in mind, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Rabbi Dr. Edward Reichman. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing with us. Great to see you as always, although you definitely look different now than you looked in the ER.
Ruvain, great to see you. Really wonderful to join you for this session, as it was to join you for the session just a few weeks ago from the emergency department. It is great to be back in Chicago, figuratively. Actually, I'm a Skokie alumnus, so it's doubly great to be back, not only from your show but also as an alumnus of Skokie Yeshiva. So really a pleasure to join you.
You never know who's going to be watching you. So we got an email that I forwarded to Rabbi Dr. Reichman from Yogi Rimmel, and the Skokie Yeshiva, the Fasmi Yeshiva High School, the Hebrew Theological College, the tentacle goes far, go far, and so do the kollel connections. So it's great. And as we think about refuahs and doctors, and we wish Ephraim a continued refuah, and Itai, for those who weren't following, Baruch Hashem, Itai is actually, believe it or not, Itai is now out of the hospital. He's out of Shari Tzedek. He's graduated to Alin. I spoke to Ephraim this past week. He's gone to see him, and they're doing special therapy. So it's thank God, Baruch Hashem, Yeshuas. We should all have refuahs and Yeshuas. So the medical community does the Reburial Shalom's work in amazing ways. So thank you for being here. We're delighted for you to present tonight on tonight's topic on Kol HaKovod, on the COVID perspective in a I guess a historical context based on your research.
Great. So I know you had Rabbi Dr. Glatt last week, and I should just point out also that the Jewish community at large really owes Rabbi Dr. Glatt a tremendous debt of gratitude. He has been a guiding light in these complex times, and he continues to advise not only his local community, but nationally and internationally. So it's he really is someone that the Jewish community should be very proud of and appreciative of. I know he spoke last week about halachic issues. This week, I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective. While I will be addressing some halachic issues, what I'd also like to do is really put this entire contemporary pandemic into its historical context. And my objective through the slide presentation that I prepared for you today is to demonstrate, hopefully by the end of this session, we will all appreciate that while in many ways this has been an unprecedented period in our lives, that there are indeed many aspects of this current pandemic that are precedented, that in fact our ancestors have dealt with, that poskim of previous generations have dealt with, and I think you will find it quite remarkable, despite the differences, which we will point out also, that some of the similarities are quite extraordinary. So with your permission, Ruvain, I will open up the slideshow if that's okay.
Let's do it. You're the co-host.
Okay, please confirm for me, Ruben, that you're able to see the slideshow.
Yes, I see it on the screen.
Great. Okay, perfect.
There it is. Now it's in full screen.
Great. Okay, perfect. Perfect. So you can see the title of our session for this evening is called Precedented Time, as it is not a misprint. We are going to discuss the rabbinic response to pandemics throughout the ages. This is a COVID-19 map taken from just a few minutes ago, 6/11, 7:33 p.m. That's Eastern time. Sorry. And you can see that the red is where COVID is affecting the world. There have been 7.5 million confirmed cases, and Rahman al-Islam, there have been 420,000 global deaths from this COVID pandemic. This is the map that you see is one of the dimensions which is unprecedented. The rapid spread in a short period of time, literally across the globe, is something that we have not seen in a pandemic in the past, and that's obviously due to our travel in the 21st century, and that is clearly an unprecedented medical dimension of this contemporary pandemic. I'd like to focus, however, for our discussion on the Jewish aspects, on the halachic aspects in particular, comparing the unprecedented and the precedented dimensions. Another aspect which is unprecedented, which you got a taste of a little bit last week with Rabbi Dr. Glad as well, is the fact that we are privy to the Piskei Halacha of the Gedolei HaPoskim on these issues as they evolve in real time. This has never been the case throughout our history, for sure, in terms of dealing with such a catastrophe as the ravages of disease and as is the case with pandemics. We will see through the course of our discussion some Piskei Halacha on pandemics in the past. If you lived at that time, you would never know in real time, unless you were the recipient of the psak. You would rarely know what the psak was. You would only discover it later when books were written, and these tshuvas were included amongst hundreds of other tshuvas dealing with a variety of other topics. Now we have Gedolei HaPoskim, and here you see before you Rav Asher Weiss Shlita, Rav Shechter Shlita, Rav Dr. Steinberg Shlita, Rav Rimon Shlita, both here in the United States and Eretz Yisrael, all writing Piskei Halacha Svarim, complete Svarim. Rav Asher Weiss already has a third volume, over 200 pages of Piskei Halacha. This is something which is truly unprecedented. But we are going to focus on aspects which are a little more precedented. And here you see before you the contemporary response to coronavirus. This actually happens to be a picture of me in my hazmat suit. But you will notice actually that immediately to the right is the plague, a classic plague doctor. And the plague doctor is not really dissimilar in the fact that the plague doctor has a full robe, has gloves, has shoes covered, has a mask. Of course, the mask is a little different. The beak, the purpose of the beak was actually to have sweet-smelling substances because the odors amongst the plague patients was quite severe, which would make it very challenging for the physician to enter the room. What we are going to do is really a head-to-head, if you will. We're going to discuss Piskei Corona from today and compare or contrast them to pandemic Piskei Halacha of past generations. And just to give you an idea of the gamut of pandemics and major diseases over the millennia, this is a list starting from 2nd century, the Antonine Plague. Here you have the Black Death in the 14th century, which many of you are familiar with. Italian plagues, which we're going to discuss Piskei Halacha from those plagues from the 1600s, and the cholera pandemics from the 1800s and early 1900s. And of course, the Spanish flu, which is often mentioned in the media as the most recent pandemic that the United States has experienced, and it's really been over a century since we've experienced anything like we're experiencing today. And of course, on the bottom of this list, now a very prominent member of the list of pandemics is COVID-19. We hope that this word present changes very rapidly to past, and is behind us, Mitzvah Hashem, soon. It is only a few months ago, in March, that the World Health Organization declared a pandemic, that coronavirus was officially declared a pandemic. What is the definition of a pandemic? A pandemic is a disease that is not just restricted to one geographical area, but actually spreads across multiple geographical areas. What is the significance of such a definition, or is there an analogous definition in the world of halacha? So we turn to thousands of years ago from the text of the Gemara, from the Gemara of Tainus. The Gemara of Tainus says its own definition of pandemic or plague, if you will. And it says, V'chein ir sheyesh ba dever u'mapoles, oso ha'ir mis'ana u'masras. So any city which is afflicted with dever is plague. By the way, it comes from the Eser Makos, the same word, same etymology. Any city which is afflicted with plague, that city must fast, and it also must have the shofar blown as well. Ezehu dever, the Gemara says, how do you define dever? Ir hamotzia chamesh meos ragli. If a city can produce 500 soldiers, the yatsu mimenu shlosha mesim b'shlosha yamim ze achar zeh. And there are 3 deaths on 3 consecutive days from this particular disease. That reaches the threshold of dever, and as such would activate the alarm, if you will, for fasting and for blowing the shofar. So you see, there was an analogous concept of a definition of plague even in the times of the Gemara. Shelter-in-place orders. I don't know how things were in Chicago or Reburial, but in New York, we were pretty much confined to our homes for a prolonged period of time.
We certainly were, and even here, that phasing is just starting to open up. We're still in phase 3 of the Illinois reopening phase, and most of the CRC affiliated shuls, most of the shuls in my neighborhood in Skokie, but also some of the shuls in Chicago, Peterson Park, Lake Lincolnwood, they're still not open because of this restriction.
We are also in New York, literally just now beginning to open. Shuls are opening mostly outside Minyanim, and literally just this week we started to open inside Minyanim. And of course, the Minyanim, the shuls cannot accommodate the full congregation, so many people are davening still in outside Minyanim. This concept of sheltering in place is likewise mentioned in the Gemara. Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanon dever bo'ir kanes raglecha. If there's a plague in the city, gather your feet. What does it mean, gather your feet? It means stay at home. Don't go anywhere. And lest you think that there wasn't disagreement about this, there are those who had different notions about how one should address the plague. Keeping in mind, by the way, for a topic for a broader discussion, not in the context of this discussion, how people in the pre-modern era understood contagion and how disease was spread. So obviously they didn't understand bacteriology and virology as we do today in the 21st century. That's really a product of the 18th, 19th century, really, the late 19th century. But despite that, they understood that there was disease and that disease did spread. And they understood different ideas of contagion, but they understood that there was a concept of contagion. So how do they address disease? So this is the Ramah writing in Shulchan Aruch. It says, Od kasu sheyesh livroach min ha'ir keshedever bo'ir. That one shouldn't kanes raglecha, as the Gemara says, rather one should flee from the city. And there are mefarshim that address perhaps one should flee at the beginning. If one doesn't flee, then maybe one should kanes raglecha, try and be miyashiv the Ramah with the Gemara. But the Ramah himself testifies in his Hakdama to Mechir Yain, which is a sefer he wrote to his father-in-law for a Purim gift, that he himself fled during a plague in Krakow, and he went from Krakow to the city of Shidlov. It's Bir Shidlov, Makom Asher Ein Te'ein V'Gefen. He was banished to Shidlov because of the plague. He fled during the plague, so he practiced what he preached. And in lieu of Shalach Manas, he actually sent his father-in-law this sefer on the Megillah. Wearing a mask is something which is required here in New York and required in many places throughout the country. Here you see some interesting masks. The center mask is leave it to the Israelis to design such a mask. It's a mask that you can see has an opening in the center with a remote control that's held in the hand that'll open it like a flap so you can eat while you still have your mask. It's a very, very clever patent, if you will, and will be available pretty soon from Eretz Yisrael. Is there a precedent for masks?
Maybe just from a medical question.
Going back quite far,
just a question for a second.
to the Torah, or at least really the Middle Ages, the interpretation of the Psukim of the Torah, about a figure for whom our discussion has relevance, and that is the Tzarua, the one afflicted with Saras. And the pasuk says, "V'hatzarua asher bo hanega begadav yufrumim v'rosho yefarua ve'al safam yateh." He shall cover his upper lip. So the Ibn Ezra says, what's the reason he has to cover his upper lip? V'atam shelo yazik beruach piv. That he shouldn't cause damage. So he shouldn't inflict disease with the breath of his mouth, implying that perhaps there's some form of contagion for which the mouth needs to be covered. And to bring it into a more contemporary or closer to contemporary context, the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Brura, writes the following in the context of Hilchos Tisha B'Av and fasting in the midst of plague, and when there was a cholera pandemic in this period. And he wrote, if someone wants to fast in the midst of the plague, it's better if they stay home. However, if they want to leave, if they do want to leave, they should put near their mouth and their nose a piece of camphor. Camphor is a wax-like material which has been used for hundreds of years as a fumigant to protect people from different forms of disease and from plagues. And assumedly, he should put this in some kind of mask to cover his mouth.
Dr. Reichman?
Yes.
Could you comment just for a second on this issue about the mask? Does it matter, just for practical purposes for people who are watching, does it matter if you have a K95 mask, a regular mask? What's the nafkamina, and how practically, how concerned are people? You showed before that unbelievable hazmat suit. Are you still wearing that every day when you go in?
So I am still wearing, when I see patients, I'm still wearing a face shield and an N95 mask and a gown and scrubs underneath. For every patient that we see, we are still seeing corona patients. I was in the emergency room this afternoon. Baruch Hashem, there are very, very much fewer corona patients. We're only seeing a handful, even less than a handful a day, but we're still seeing everyday corona patients. As far as what the community needs to wear, the community outside, when you're going to the store, you're going outside, you do not need to wear a medical grade mask at all. These so-called N95s are really only for clinicians, healthcare workers that are encountering patients in a close-up encounter, possibly doing procedures on those patients. But for the purposes of the rest of the community, any facial covering is absolutely sufficient. And the purpose of the facial covering is to both protect you from others and to protect others from you. And it really contains any coughs or any sneeze and prevents them from being propelled forward sometimes 6, 10, 15 feet. And possibly infecting others. So any type of facial covering would be sufficient.
Got it. It's interesting that Ibn Ezra that you mentioned, this idea of atifa, I think some posts can mention that that's an afkamina lamaisa, because when a person puts on a talus in the morning, I remember growing up, or even today, I don't watch so much because I'm busy putting on my own talus, but people put on talisim, and when they put on the talus gadol, we do an atifa. Well, what does an atifa look like? Well, based on what we're explaining, that al safam yate, it doesn't mean, I think some people, they take the talus, they put it all the way over the top of their head, right? Like a tent, and it goes all the way down to their safam. But the problem is that if you put your talus over your head like that, you can't walk, you can't see. So the pashtus is what they were doing was that they would put the talus on the top of their head, and they would take the edge of their talus, let's say with your hand, and wrap it across their face. So that teaches us, so they were covering their mouth, like Ibn Ezra said, you weren't going to cough on somebody. So that means that when we put on our talis in the morning, we don't take our talis and put it all the way over our head down to our mouth. Rather, we put the talis on the top of the head and we take the side of the talis.
And wrap it around. Very nice. Very good. I like that, Rabbi.
Because this way
very
you
good
can still see. You still see.
Right. So that's great. That's a great shot and a tifa. And getting back to Tsaras again, coronavirus and isolation, and we'll differentiate isolation from quarantine in a minute. Isolation is used to separate people infected with the virus from people who are not infected with the virus. And here too, the quarantine or isolation, if you will, was applied to the tzarua. Kol yimei asher nega bo yitma tamehu badad yeshev mechutz lamachane. The tzarua, the one afflicted with tsaras, had to sit in isolation. And the Das HaKenim says, "Lefisha oso choli mitpashet b'bnei adam haragili meitzla." So he says because the illness associated with tsaras could potentially be contagious, and as a result, he would need to be in isolation. So this is just an allusion, according to the Das HaKenim, of the concept of isolation. But to bring isolation into a real context of pandemic, I introduce you to the work of Avraham Catalano, which is really an extraordinary work written in the 1600s by a physician who was living in Padua at that period of time, and he was in charge of the entire Jewish community's response to a major plague, the Bubonic plague, which afflicted the community of Padua and other communities of Italy at that time. And he has a diary that he wrote about every detail of aspects of the community, the financial aspects, the halachic aspects, every aspect, and the names of everybody who was nifter, the names of everybody who was sick. It's really quite a remarkable historical document. So he writes, we in the Jewish community began to build our own Lazaretto. Now, Lazaretto is a name that you'll find actually even in the Tshuva literature. It refers to a house of isolation where people afflicted with disease would go. And in fact, the etymology of Lazaretto comes from Lazarus, which is in the Christian tradition, who possibly may have been afflicted with tsaras. So they used to put people who were tsarua, who had leprosy, and whether leprosy is tsaras is for another discussion. But they used to isolate people in these lazarettos, and the Jews had their lazarettos too, for diseases to prevent them from inflicting others with the disease. Quarantine is a little different technically than isolation, though they're used interchangeably. Quarantine is when someone has been exposed and you want them to be separated from society to determine if they will contract the disease or not. So, for example, Israel put travelers in quarantine when they came to visit. And in fact, the very word quarantine, the etymology of the word quarantine comes from quarantina, which means 40 days. And back in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, in places like Italy, they would quarantine people coming from abroad that came into port via ship. It started even in the times of the Black Death, but it continued for many centuries. And they would quarantine them for 40 days before they would allow them onto shore, lest they possibly infect people in their local communities. And we see quarantine was also applied in that plague in Padua that Avraham Catalano writes about. He writes, Emmanuel Bono fell ill and buboes were seen near his ears. Buboes are these lesions on the skin from bubonic plague. Eliyahu Francisi attended to him, and Bono subsequently died. Francisi was then quarantined. Then the wife of Menachem Minkin died, and her household was quarantined, and others were nifter, and their households were quarantined as well. Another aspect of the modern coronavirus is tefillos. Many specific tefillos were written for coronavirus. And here you have a tefillah from a group of Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael, and here you have a tefillah from a group of Rabbanim in Italy. And one common denominator in many of these tefillos is the recitation of Pitum HaKtoris, the preparation of the incense for the Ketoris in the Beis HaMikdash. You will see that this has been a feature not just of the 21st century, this has been a feature for many, many hundreds of years. And here you have a small sample. There are hundreds and hundreds of tefillos in libraries across the world from different pandemics. This one happens to be from cholera, Tikkun L'Chole HaCholera. This one is Dever, which is a generic plague. And many of them, including this one from Italy in the 1700s, included the recitation of Pitum Actoris. The question is, why do they include recitation of Pitum Actoris? So the answer is comes from the Torah itself. There was a Magefa after the rebellion of Korach, and Moshe Rabbeinu said, "Kaches hamachto," he said to Aaron, take the Ketores, it was a tzivur to take it out of the Mishkan, which really wasn't allowed. And what happened when he brought Ketores into the Machane when there was a Magefa? The end result was Vateotzar HaMagefa, the Magefa ceased, the Magefa stopped. And ever since then, throughout the centuries, the Jews have been reciting Pitum Actoris in association with Magefas as a possible tikkun and as a possible cure or protection in times of Magefa. Closing houses of worship is something that we just discussed a minute ago, Ruvain. Here in the United States, here in Eretz Yisrael, and this is one of those things also which is unprecedented, with the exception possibly of a handful of shuls across the globe. Almost the entire world, the shuls of almost the entire world were shut down simultaneously. That's something that's never transpired in our history, in that sense. But have there been closures of shuls in the past? So the answer to that is yes. And here you have evidence from that by a hesped, which was published in the 1500s after Magefa in Venice, which killed 50,000 people, by Reb Shmudi Yehuda Katznelbogen, who was the son of the Maharam of Padua. And he wrote just as an introduction to the hesped, Hesped Asisi Bechotzer Haget. I delivered this hesped in the courtyard of the ghetto for the Gaon of Zalman Katz of Mantua, because the Bate Knesios Segurim Mipnei HaMagefa, because the shuls were all closed due to the plague. And similarly,
maybe just
sorry, Ruben, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, maybe just enlighten us for a second. Just what does that mean? Today, numbers, I assume today numbers are different than they were in those times, in the sense that today we have a lot of interconnectivity, we have communication, but in those times, how did they even gather that data? How did they even know? And how did people communicate to each other, or what was going on? Sure.
So in those days, the communities were much smaller. And people knew and people saw, and doctors realized that there was plague, and governments realized that there was plague, and they intervened and instituted these Lazarettos, and they instituted, we'll see in a moment on the next slide, we'll see some of the other restrictions which were instituted in different times across different countries. But it's true, it may have taken them a little longer to appreciate. Today, people get that data rather quickly because there's email transmissions and texting, and doctors are communicating with each other all the time. So if they see a disease which is prevalent, you would know within a relatively short period of time. Then it probably took them a lot longer to come to that realization. And it's probably at a stage where already many people had died from whatever disease was prevalent at that time. But this comes from Otzer Achaim, which is medical work by Yaakov Zahalon, who graduated university in Rome, the medical school and University of Rome. And he was also a very prominent Rav and a great darshan. People used to flock from all over to hear his drushas. And he also attests to the closure of shuls. And he writes in his medical work, when he talks about the plague, he adds some other interesting information. He writes, since the people were unable to come to shul on Shabbos Parshas Toldos, and actually I'll pull off for a second, this actually is the original sefer of Otzer Achaim. It's a 1693 from Venice. It was only printed one time. Nowadays, of course, you can get it online, the entire text online, the digital PDF from, I think, HebrewBooks.org. But he writes, I'll read it for you. Mipnei shelo hayu yecholim ha'am leilech lebeis hakneses l'chein b'Shabbos Parshas Toldos Kislev Hey Taf Yud Zayin, which is I'll come back to the slide.
How did you get a hold of that sefer? That is unbelievable.
So this sefer is I actually purchased the year I got engaged. It's a funny personal story. I'll share it with you perhaps some other time. But my wife was actually concerned that we were not going to get engaged because I spent so much money on this safer. She thought I wouldn't have enough money for the ring. So she thought it was all over once I bought that safer. So we have a running joke. We have a running joke about that. But he writes, he continues to write, Yaakov Zahalon delivered a sermon. This was November 18th, 1656, at the corner of Catalani Street from the window of the home of David Gattini. Mentions the house and the place, and the congregation stood in the street below to listen because the shuls were closed. So he gave a drasha from the balcony, and he says he did it again and again over that period of time. He also adds some of the restrictions, which I think we will be familiar with. So he writes, for example, it was not permitted for anyone to leave their homes during these plagues, except to visit a physician. At designated times, people were allowed to leave to obtain food. At night, no one was allowed out of their homes, and if they were found on the streets, they would be placed in a prison within the ghetto. And if you think that punishment was severe, people could not congregate. And we've had the police here in New York area break up Jewish communities that have had weddings or simchas, or even funerals or levayas that had too many people, and the police would come and break up these groups of people during the times of this pandemic. In those days, a gallows was built near the gate of the ghetto to punish those who violated the law of congregating in public during the times of the pandemic. And here you see an actual illustration from the Rome ghetto. This is the entrance to the Rome ghetto. You have to look a little closely. I apologize.
It's amazing.
This is the gallows. This is the illustration of the gallows, which appeared. This is an illustration from the mid 1700s. This is exactly what it looked like. And if you would congregate, this is the gallows that would be used, hopefully just as a deterrent and not an actual punishment for people who violated that prohibition. Participation in a minyan and balcony minyanim. So this is one of those things. I don't know, Ruvain, if you've been getting these shilas in Chicago, but in New York, it's a big issue because we have a lot of these massive buildings and apartment houses, and people want to have such tremendous desire to continue their minyanim in times of these pandemic. So they want to have minyanim in balconies, and of course in backyards is less of a problem, but balconies in terms of tziruf is a major shaila. And Rav Shechter Shlita weighed in on this. He's not a big fan of these balcony minyanim, and Rav Asher Weiss on the bottom of this slide has weighed in on this. My objective is not to focus on the contemporary debate, but just to show you again that even this debate is precedented. I have a remarkable tshuva from the Chida. And what was the shaila of the Chida? There were two groups of people that wanted to be mitzdayer for a minyan, 4 in one group and 6 in another group. However, 4 of them were in a Lazaretto. If you recall, just a few moments ago, we said that a Lazaretto is an isolation house for people affected with disease. They couldn't leave. There was a guard standing at that house. They shouldn't leave anyway, even if there's no guard. So they were stuck in that house. But they could see the other 6 people who were in another house who were relatively close by. So the question is, could they be mitzdayer for a minyan? They wanted to be mitzdayer. They so much desire to be mitzdayer. These other 6 people didn't have other people in the neighborhood to be mitzdayer. So the Chida actually paskin in that case that indeed they could be mitzdayer for a minyan. I'm not sure what he would have weighed in today in terms of the balcony minyanim. But another aspect which we have all become familiar with is now added to our vocabulary: social distancing. Social distancing in shul. Now we are returning to shul, but only with social distancing. You can't come to shul otherwise. At least for now. Mitzvah Hashem, that should change. And here you have a picture at the Kotel. This is actually Birchas Kohanim at the Kotel with social distancing. Quite a stark, remarkable picture. Was there social distancing in the past? So behold some remarkable sources about social distancing in the previous eras. Here again, I quote from Avram Catalano from the plague in Padua in 1631. And he wrote, "Az gazarnu al kol asher inenu nasui lihisyatzev lispalel chutz lebeis hakneses." So we declared, he was a member of the committee which made policy, and he said we have to clear out the shul so there's more space. Otherwise, if we're all close together, there's a greater chance for spread of disease. So first thing he said is if you're not married, which is an easy identification in the community, then you have to daven in the courtyard. Chutz Beis Knesses Ashkenazim b'Chatzer Beis Knesses. Ve'Italkim b'Makom Hanoshim laha'amid b'Merchav Raglei HaMispalin. So the Italians, the Italkim, who would normally daven in their own shul, came to the Ashkenazi shul in Padua. And if you've been to Padua, they're literally one is a few hundred yards, less than a few hundred yards from the other. The Ashkenazi shul that he's talking about that they davened in is now the museum, the Jewish museum in Padua, if you go visit Padua. So he says the single men should daven outside in the courtyard, and those of from the Italki shul should daven up in the balcony, in the women's balcony, therefore spreading out everybody to enhance social distancing. And he writes that after a period of time, there were so many fatalities that they didn't even need social distancing, and they could barely get a minyan. And he says poetically and very sadly, he says, "Vayhi mikdash me'at mibli ba'e moed." So he has a play on words, mikdash me'at. Mikdash me'at usually means that the shul is a microcosm of the Beis HaMikdash, and it's considered the mini Beis HaMikdash, if you will. But here he uses it to indicate that the synagogue was desolate and few, if any, people came to daven with a minyan. Rav Mecklenburg, Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, the author of Ksava Kabbalah, in his time, during the pandemic for cholera, suggested that on Yom Kippur, women shouldn't come to shul, also to protect them, and possibly for the men to daven in the women's section and to socially distance as well. But here you have a remarkable tshuva, which some of you may have seen, which has been popularized in the midst of this pandemic, and this represents really formal social distancing by Rabbi Eiger. And he wrote, this is for daily Minyanim, and we'll see what he did for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur in a minute. But he wrote, in my view, it is true that gathering in a small space is inappropriate, but it is possible to pray in groups, each one very small, about 15 people. The groups should begin davening at first light, so at Nate's, and they should basically rotate. And he writes you should sign up. Everybody should sign up for their minyan, and you should rotate minyanim. And he also said, fascinatingly, they should be careful that more people than the aforementioned quota should not push their way into the shul, perhaps by using a guard from the police to oversee. So he even recommended employing the police to enforce this.
Which is fascinating. One quick question / observation. As you're mentioning these various piskei halacha and models from history, I guess from your perspective, how much of this can be relied on in terms of practical application versus these are just constructs that we can rely on as opposed to actually deciding numbers for contemporary minyanim? Do we look to Rabbi Eiger and say, oh, that tshuva said Rabbi Eiger said 15, Memela, we're also going to say 15? Or is it just Rabbi Eiger acknowledged the same reality and we need to follow the medical advice of our contemporary experts?
So I think it is clearly the latter. One of the things which is reflected in the tshuvas of Rabbi Eiger specifically about the pandemic of cholera, on which he is writing in this tshuva, and then another one we'll see in just a moment, is that he was tremendously deferential to the medical advice of his time, and he constantly referred to the recommendations of the government in terms of medical requirements for staying at home, for preventing transmission of disease. To apply, obviously, the medical principles of that time to today would be an inappropriate extrapolation because obviously our perception and understanding of science is different. Even his number is a small number, it's an approximation number. It is funny that the governor of New York allowed 10 people to congregate. So obviously, 10 was guided by the requirement of 10 people for a minyan. But these are rough approximations. The principles I think we can apply, and as you'll see in a moment, in a fascinating second tshuva. So, for example, today people who wanted to daven for Shavuos at the Kotel had to to use a lottery to determine if they would be able to daven there because there wasn't enough space with social distancing. Usually the kotel's packed with thousands of people. Here, you could have maybe a few hundred. So they had to choose a lottery ticket to see if they would have the schus of davening at the kotel. And we see Rabbi Eiger did the same thing. He also thought of doing a lottery. When? For Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And we are coming up on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur now, and we have to deal with this, and it's not so clear how our communities are going to deal with this. But he said that only half the seats should be occupied, and that every other seat should be empty, and that there should be a lottery to determine, so half the community should come on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, and the other half of the community should come on Yom Kippur. How are you going to determine who comes on which day? So the answer is you do a lottery. And whoever wins, you do an A and a B. Whoever chooses A comes for Rosh Hashanah. Whoever chooses B comes on Yom Kippur. He also said military police should guard the entrances and check the tickets. He also said davening should be limited to 5 hours. No recitation of piyutim. No hosafos. Chazan should dreitzach with chazanis. People would like this all year round, of course, not necessarily during the times of pandemic, but his recommendations are very important recommendations. Now, apropos your point, today we need 6 feet of distancing recommended for social distancing. Skipping every other seat would not be sufficient for our social distancing today. We would probably need 2 or 3, probably 3 seats, in order to achieve that. So just to check in with you, Rabbi Ruvain, I have about 5 to 10 more minutes. Is that okay? Or I can.
Perfect. Great.
Okay, great. So mezuzahs is also something which were discussed today. In the very early days, one of the first Piskei Halacha by the chief rabbi of David Lau was that you shouldn't kiss mezuzahs. Here you have a nice, magnificent mezuzah because of the possibility of contagion. They also had shilos about mezuzah in previous times, but not specifically about kissing the mezuzah and contagion. But this is also from the Chidah, a different tshuva from different sefer of his called Chaim Sha'al, where he was asked about people who lived in these isolation houses called the Lazarettos, Ba'ara Smichta, Lazaretto, Asher Ba'ari Adom Eretz Rabbah, and he was asked, Im Chayev Likboa Mezuzah, if you're living in this Lazaretto, and you end up staying there longer than 30 days, do you have to be kovea a mezuzah in the doorpost of the Lazaretto? So he actually paskins, since even if you're there longer than 30 days, since by definition it's a diras aroy, it's not intended for prolonged use or for prolonged stay, there's no chiyuv mezuzah. And the impact of psychology and the psychological state has found its expression in the contemporary plague of corona. So it's a tshuva by Rav Shechter Shlita, who talks about listening to music during the times of Sira, which is generally, our minhag is not to listen to music during the times of Sira. And he writes, during this time of global suffering, it would appear that for some individuals, refraining from listening or playing to music may leave one in a state of sadness or emotional distress. This would appear to reach beyond the intent of the restriction. So he actually was more makil from a psychological perspective to allow people to listen to music.
I think it's going to be interesting when we get to the 3 weeks, unless the Mashiach comes first, to figure out that same question, because the 3 weeks are more chomer than are the poskim going to be lenient as well when it comes to the 3 weeks and the 9 days, how that relates to the same question.
Right. Good question. Well, hopefully, it shouldn't become relevant. But this notion of the impact of psychology is also reflected in this tshuva of Chaim Palachi from the 1800s during a cholera pandemic. And I thank Dr. Ari Greenspan for pointing out this source to me. He talks about gambling. And he says that gambling is not something which one should do. So I decree that any man who is called by the term wise, Talmud Chacham, should never gamble anytime. Any game, not on Purim, not on Chalamoid, not at weddings, not in small villages, etc. However, except if there happens to be Iker Zulas im yeh chas v'sholom chole or im yeh choli bo'ir chas v'sholom kimagefa v'kalora v'chayotze bo. Unless there's a time of a pandemic. In the times of pandemic, sometimes gambling can ease someone's stress and ease someone's fears. So in that limited kind of circumstance, it may in fact be mutter. I wonder who the mashgichim at the casinos were, but I guess that's another issue. And just a side historical note: there's a famous Rav from Venice in the Renaissance, Italian Rav Yehuda Arya Modena, who is famous for writing tshuvas on gambling. He actually probably was a compulsive gambler. He probably had a gambling addiction. He actually writes it in his own biography, his own autobiography. And he writes, I won't read it for you inside, but I'm happy to share the slides with you, that he actually relapsed into gambling during the times of this particular pandemic in Venice in 1631. So I think if Chaim Palachi's psak wouldn't have applied to somebody who is a compulsive gambler, it may have applied to someone who doesn't gamble frequently. Bikur Cholim is something which many of the Bikur Cholim societies were very concerned about, the possibility of exposure to disease. And this is another sefer on the corona, Yad Ber Amim, by Rabbi Avishai Taharani from Eretz Yisrael. And he, like many others, writes that you really shouldn't do Bikur Cholim in this time. You shouldn't visit someone who's in isolation because of the possibility of afflicting them with disease. Does this have precedent in previous times? Excuse me. So here you have from the Bikur Cholim Society of Berlin in 1750. This is their manual that everybody read in the community who was a member. And they wrote, in those days, the Bikur Cholim Society served a much greater function, but they wrote, Gam kibalnu aleinu levaker kol choli. We accepted upon ourselves to visit everybody who is sick. Chutz im yebo chas v'sholom eze choli she'eno shkiach she'roi larchik mimenu, Rachmana litzlan. Unless someone is afflicted with diseases which are contagious diseases, and they mentioned diarrheal illnesses like cholera. And here I mentioned two specific diseases which you might recognize the names: Pakin, which is smallpox, and this is a mem. This is mazalin, which is measles. And it was just a year ago when we were dealing with measles in the Jewish community, and everyone was writing about measles and vaccination. And little did we know that would be just a small blip on the radar screen, and we'd be dealing with coronavirus a year later. The impact as we get towards the end of life, one of the very tragic aspects of this pandemic is the massive loss of life. And here you have from newspapers, 2 funeral directors on how the pandemic has upended the business of death. And there's many tragic scenarios of bodies that Rachmana litzlan weren't able to be buried by virtue of the great number of required burials. And here you have, this is a recent picture, mass burials of people whose relatives were not known, and it's really quite tragic. And here you have this is also reflected in some of the old literature from in rabbinic literature as well. And here you have a very interesting comment about this, which is in the Hakdama to a particular sefer by Yosef ibn Verga from the 16th century. His father was Shlomo ibn Verga, who's the author of a sefer called Shevet Yehuda, which some of you may be familiar with. But he writes that in the Hakdama to a sefer, which is on Klolei Hashas, says, I, the bereft and embittered Yosef ibn Verga, compiled this small volume in the year of a plague. Both the printers and I were overwhelmed and harried every day going back and forth to attend to the burial of the dead. I therefore shortened a number of sections I had in my heart to write. I also realized there will be mistakes due to the prevailing great fear and panic. So you see actually a fascinating manifestation of the impact of multiple burials. And here you have another aspect, which is halacha l'maisa today, very much so, unfortunately. A number of people who are nifter here in the United States had intent to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, but they couldn't get to Eretz Yisrael. The bodies couldn't be buried in Eretz Yisrael. There was travel restrictions. So Shechter Shlita was asked, can they exhume the body and move it at a later stage, disinter the body and move it at a later stage. And he posted that indeed it would absolutely be mutter to do so, especially if you made a t'nai that when you buried that you specifically wanted to move the body. And this is something also which this is a tshuva from Chassam Sofer, but many others discussed it. The tshuva in Yeridea. In those days, during one of the cholera pandemics, they actually had an entire cemetery just for cholera victims. And the Jews and everyone who died from cholera were buried in that cemetery. And it wasn't Shamor, there wasn't people watching the cemetery. It wasn't an ideal place for Jews to visit. So the shaila was, could they exhume the bodies later and subsequently bury them? And the Chassam Sofer also paskin that it was indeed mutter to do so. Shiva practices have changed radically, as we all know. Unfortunately, if we ourselves haven't had family members who have been afflicted and nifter from this terrible tragedy, we most assuredly all know people who do. And many of us have had to pay what are now called Zoom Shiva visits, another addition to our vocabulary. Shiva also was altered in previous times. So for example, the Shulchan Aruch says explicitly, Yesh omrim b'shas hadever ein misablin. You shouldn't have any avelus, none, no Shiva, not a Zoom Shiva either. Mishum biasusa, and he says that's because of fear. And what is the fear? And with this, we come to a close for our session today. What is the fear? So one fear, so the Divrei Malkiel writes, there's two potential fears. One fear is that you'll be afraid of contracting the disease from the Menachemim. That's and people congregate together. There's a fear of contagion. But he also has a very interesting psychological insight. And he writes that in my translation, actually, no, I'm sorry, this isn't my translation. This is Rabbi Torchiner's translation and Rabbi Baruch Weintraub's translation. It seems the intention of the law is that at a time of wrath, there are many who die. Thus, if all the relatives of all those who have died will observe mourning rituals, it will greatly scare the living, because it will be clear that many people have died. But if there will be no mourning rituals, the death won't be as apparent. And it's sort of interesting. In those days, they were more concerned about the psychological impact of seeing that there were so many Shivas, that people would be so emotionally distraught that if they contracted the disease, they would be more likely to die as a result of the disease. And today, if you open up the newspapers, we had one local newspaper that had 50 pages of obituaries in the times of coronavirus. So there's so many people's nifta, and it's a very fascinating psychological insight. But I close with this comment, and want to shift from the negative to the positive. This comment was written by Elio Davidas, a student of Moshe Cordovero and a student of the Arizal, and it's a statement which could have been written today. It's a remarkable insight about magefas throughout the passage of time. And he writes, Magefa hishlucha meito yizbarach ba'avonoseinu. Magefa, plagues, come from time to time, often as a result of our avonos, of our sins. Asher yamus bonar v'zakein, when both young and old, tafenoshim, women and children tragically die, belisiba, without clear understanding of the reason for this tragedy. B'choli zen yizbalbel das harofim. And for these magefos, for these plagues which come from time to time, the physicians are confused, the physicians are befuddled. The physicians don't understand what's good for this disease, what's bad for this disease. And in fact, despite our extraordinary advances, it's very humbling that even though we've come so far in bacteriology and virology and even vaccination, still we have been devastated by this plague. But the positive element is that all of these past pandemics, throughout all these centuries, Klal Yisrael has survived them with our tfilos, with our maasim tovim, with Chazdei Hashem. We as a community, as a people, have not only survived, but have continued to thrive after all of these plagues. Mitzvah Hashem, we should be zocha that we could talk about this particular pandemic in past tense, and with God's help, Mitzvah Hashem, not only be the end of this presentation, but the end of all plagues and pandemics. And in Mitzvah Hashem, all those who are in need of refuah should have refuah.
Amen.
And
Amen.
thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this encyclopedic presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your insight, which for all of us who are watching and appreciating this perspective and how it does give us the opportunity to reflect on we're part of a Masorah, we're part of a chain of tradition of Jews of hundreds of years who have found similar ways of dealing with the situation that we find ourselves in now. So as you started, on the one hand, this is unprecedented, but you said it's precedented. Now we can see the context. So thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. Thank you for spending the time. Be well, continue to stay safe, and be matzliach in all of your incredible avodas hakodesh.
Thank you so much, Reburial. You too, a tremendous chus to join you.